Thanks, Bill. And hello, everybody. I'm very sorry I can't be there right now, but COVID has felled me. So bear with me. And I'd be happy to take your questions later. My book, Dinner with the President, has just come out, and I'm excited to talk about uh, all the research I've done. I covered 26 presidents from George Washington starving at Valley Forge in 1777, all the way up to Donald Trump and his burgers and Joe Biden and his ice cream. Um, and the notion is to examine the politics of food and the food of politics. And FDR is such a wonderful example of how those things can go together. So here we go. So, like any other house, the White House runs on food. But no other building represents the presidency or is subject to as much scrutiny as 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. It is at once a home, a busy office, a social hub, a decorative arts museum, the only residence of a national leader that invites the public inside, and as Jackie Kennedy put it, an emblem of the American Republic. In short, the executive mansion is the most powerful house in the world. And so it follows that the meals and food policies created there are amongst the most influential in history. In the same vein, the president is both a symbol of the nation and a flesh and blood human being with sometimes quirky tastes. His food choices bridge those disparate roles. What he eats determines his health and sets an example for the nation, and the public pays attention. How his food is prepared by whom and the context of his meals transmits his values and priorities. His policies and the way he pulls governmental levers influence the flow of goods and services to millions of Americans and to billions of people around the world. His messaging about food touches on everything from personal taste to local politics, global nutrition, economics, science, war, race, class, gender, religion, and many other things. Food is served in the White House every day, from a simple sandwich to a cabinet lunch, a picnic on the South Lawn, or a complex state dinner. In fact, one of the main duties of the President and First Lady, sometimes referred to as the first host and hostess, is to welcome guests into their home. In most photos of these events, food is front and center, but it's often overlooked. In fact, a meal at the White House is never simply a meal. It is a forum for politics and entertainment on the highest level. In writing this book, I was struck by how some presidents and or first ladies have an intuitive understanding of the value of food and entertaining as political and diplomatic tools. Food is sustenance and metaphor, and who has a seat at the table and who does not matters. Canny leaders, such as Thomas Jefferson, Teddy and Franklin Roosevelt, or Dwight D. Eisenhower, understood that their choices of guests, ingredients, and entertainment can influence and amplify their agenda. Less savvy men, such as Andrew Johnson, Warren G. Harding, or Gerald Ford, have discovered that a single drunken speech, poor choice of guests, or terrible dinner can undermine their legacy. There's another aspect of White House life that people rarely consider, but can be revealing: the intimate gatherings of the first family behind the scenes. How presidential couples have balanced or failed to balance their public and private lives is often more fraught than appears and can have high political stakes. Such was the case of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. Unlike most presidents, Franklin Roosevelt spent a lot of time thinking, obsessing really, about food and drink. As the large, well-equipped kitchen at Springwood suggests, his heart skipped a beat when he was served something interesting: kippered herring or creamed chipped beef for breakfast, green gumbo, abalone steaks, or chicken in aspic for lunch, which he called dinner, appetizers of caviar and champagne, followed by dinners or supper that would challenge most Americans' palates. He liked buffalo tongues, frog's legs, oyster crabs, and tripe pepper pot. He delighted in the curious food gifts that were sent to him from all over the world. Ptarmigan from Greenland, teal duck from Egypt, a jar of crayfish, Scottish pheasant or whitefish fresh from Duluth. Now, FDR was not a cook, but he liked to brew his own French roast for breakfast and took great satisfaction in mixing cocktails, especially martinis, serving fine wines, and sipping bourbon with his guests. When the Second World War deprived Roosevelt of his favorite juicy steaks, his Epicurean fantasies could sometimes veer into the delirious. He once waxed rhapsodic about a whole fish baked in mud, the most delicious thing in the world, he declared, though his children did not believe he'd ever eaten such a creature. It was the idea that he might someday that excited him. FDR was both an instinctual gourmet and an inveterate politician, and he liked to use meals to woo allies, mollify opponents, consummate deals, and take people's measure. He researched what his guests liked to eat, drink, and smoke, then constructed a menu that was more than a simple list of things to eat. One night in the spring of 1940, for example, FDR invited Wendell Willkie to the White House for a private dinner. Roosevelt had recently defeated Willkie in the election, making him the only president to serve more than 2 terms. But he admired Willkie, a Democrat turned Republican, and wondered if he could convince his rival to take up a delicate diplomatic assignment. Roosevelt believed it was time for America to join the Allies against Nazi Germany, but a strong isolationist bloc refused to back him. Undeterred, the president was in search of a trusted envoy who could liaise with America's allies in Europe. It would be an especially challenging job, and convincing Willkie to take it on would require a silken hand. Affecting a carefree air while meticulously planning the evening, Roosevelt constructed a dinner layered with signs and symbols. The main event was terrapin soup, a delicacy made with the flesh and juices of a diamondback terrapin turtle, simmered with butter, cream, tomatoes, vegetables, a mix of spices, and a jot of sherry. It was a rich and deeply flavored broth, considered a delicacy by some, but not to everyone's taste. Roosevelt was betting that it would appeal to Willkie on several levels. First, it was one of his personal favorites and a satisfying meal. More deeply, Willkie, the son of German immigrants, was a self-made man who aspired to be a player in global politics. By serving him terrapin soup, FDR was welcoming him into a rarefied club, those who appreciated terrapin soup. And yet, another level, terrapin was a quintessentially American ingredient, one that dated back to native tribes, the colonists, and early presidents like Washington and Jefferson. By sipping terrapin soup, Willkie would join the national continuum. In other words, Roosevelt was serving Willkie a soup full of flattery. One challenge was to find a specialized cook for the dish, which was not easy. The First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, liked to bake muffins or cook scrambled eggs on a chafing dish, but was not familiar with the stove. None of the White House cooks had the requisite skills, nor did their boss, the housekeeper Henrietta Nesbitt. She feared the terrapins as, quote, huge brutes crawling around in the cellar, and once botched the soup so badly that FDR refused to let her try it again. Eventually, the president borrowed a seasoned chef from the Metropolitan Club who served a toothful version to FDR and Willkie, who sat at a small table in the White House private quarters. Over bowls of the terrapin elixir, the two built a personal and political rapport. After dinner, they retired to the president's study, where they talked, smoked, and drank whiskey deep into the night. The presidential son, Jimmy Roosevelt, reported, great bursts of laughter could be heard from behind the door, and soon after that dinner, Wilkie departed on a diplomatic mission to England, North Africa, the Soviet Union, and China on Roosevelt's behalf. Terrapin was FDR's lucky soup, and he regularly served it to foreign dignitaries and to celebrities like Will Rogers. Yet it was just the kind of food that Eleanor Roosevelt did not approve of. She viewed it as an elitist dish and disliked its earthy taste and looks. While FDR liked to serve the creamy broth, meat, bones, and flippers in the turtle's shell, Eleanor never forgot the zoologist who inspected his soup and hissed, "These are the bones of rats." Excuse me. The Roosevelts' opposing views of this single dish were emblematic of their diverging tastes. During their unmatched 12-year residence in the White House, food played an outsized role and was laden with political, economic, psychological, and emotional weight. Excuse me. For FDR, food was a reminder of home, a bridge to other cultures, a tool of persuasion, a means of self-expression and disinhibition. Though he's not often credited as an epicure on par with Thomas Jefferson, I'd say Roosevelt was blessed and cursed with the second most discerning palate of any president. Yet his fine-tuned taste set him apart from his children, Anna, Jimmy, Franklin, Elliot, Franklin Delano Jr., and John. They were hearty eaters, but their palates were influenced by Eleanor's plainer tastes. Mrs. Roosevelt regarded meals as a source of calories rather than an aesthetic experience. She favored dry whole wheat toast for breakfast, a bowl of almond soup for lunch, or kedgeree, an Anglo-Indian plate of fish, rice, and mashed hard-boiled eggs for dinner. Very few things which I eat or drink matter to me a great deal, and it is more or less habit how I take them, she said. The First Lady was far more interested in food as food, a philosophical question to be pondered, a dietary conundrum to be dissected, a way to brand the administration as responsible leaders, and a political statement about female empowerment and scientific rigor. Mother is a wonderful woman, but, as she herself will tell you, she has no appreciation of fine food, Jimmy wrote. Victuals to her are something to inject into the body as fuel to keep it going, much as a motorist pours gasoline into an auto tank. Though she was raised with wealth, Mrs. Roosevelt empathized with the millions of Americans suffering in the Depression. She didn't particularly like being First Lady, but she recognized it gave her what her cousin Teddy Roosevelt called a bully pulpit, a prominent stage. And she turned to Cornell University's Home Economics Department, which had developed a radical new vision of the housewife of the future. By training in chemistry, nutrition, and sanitation, they believed, homemakers could supplant the decadent homey meals of yore with healthy, economical, modern foodstuffs. The woman who boils potatoes year after year with no thought of the how or why is a drudge, said the president of the American Home Economics Association. But the cook who can compute the calories of heat which a potato of given weight will yield is no drudge. Thus inspired, Eleanor used the White House kitchen as a laboratory and lectern. She extolled simple, thrifty meals as lessons in self-reliance. In her newspaper column, My Day, she promoted rationed goods, such as deviled eggs with a thin tomato sauce, spaghetti topped with boiled carrots, and Milcorno, a dry skim milk and cornmeal food supplement to help stretch budgets. This rationalist approach paid little heed to the flavors, colors, textures, presentation, or associations. In other words, the emotional pleasures of eating that ignited her husband's senses. The Roosevelts' divergent tastes practically assured marital tension. And if the pairing of the urbane Franklin D. Roosevelt with the bumbling housekeeper Mrs. Nesbit seems like a dark cosmic joke, it was one authored by the First Lady. Raised in Duluth, Minnesota, Henrietta Nesbit met Mrs. Roosevelt through the Episcopal Church and the League of Women Voters up there in Hyde Park in 1927. They hailed from vastly different backgrounds, but bonded over children and Mrs. Nesbit's whole wheat bread. Tasting a loaf, Eleanor fatefully asked, "Would you mind making up some extra for us?" "Would I?" Mrs. Nesbit exclaimed. Soon she was baking for FDR's New York gubernatorial campaign, churning out breads, rolls, coffee cakes, strudels, fruit pies, plum pudding, fruit cakes, and roasted peanuts. Her husband Henry did the shopping and helped with slicing, mixing, and packaging. When FDR defeated Herbert Hoover to become president in 1932, he inherited a nation in economic chaos, declaring, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." He pushed groundbreaking laws and signed executive orders that led to the New Deal, which helped turn America's fortunes around. He was a new kind of president, but the independent-minded Eleanor chafed under the pressure and scrutiny that came with first ladyship. She had supported Franklin's campaign on the condition that she would control their domestic sphere. He agreed, and when they moved into the White House in 1933, Mrs. Roosevelt hired the Nesbits as custodian and housekeeper. Eleanor didn't care that they had no experience catering meals for hundreds of people on a brightly lit stage. She wanted someone I know, and believed that hiring the Nesbits was a charitable thing to do. It was also a quiet act of rebellion. Mrs. Nesbit held many jobs, but the most important one was to oversee the executive kitchen at the White House. She discovered that the refrigerator was old and bad-smelling. The electric wiring sparked dangerously, and cockroaches scuttled in corners. In the summer of 1935, Eleanor spearheaded a modernization, and the new kitchen gleamed with a 16-foot stove, 6 roasting ovens, a soup kettle, a meat grinder, deep fryers, waffle irons, mixers, a 30-gallon ice cream freezer, 5 dishwashers, and updated dumbwaiters to lift the food from the ground floor kitchen up to the dining rooms. And then, like a roller coaster climbing the first incline, tipping over the top and barreling down the backside, the White House cooks were off on a swooping, gut-wrenching ride. Excuse me. During World War II, government bean counters allotted the Roosevelts just 2 months of food stamps, but their calculations for coffee, sugar, meat, and canned goods were based on the lightest months of entertaining, which badly underestimated the White House's needs. Mrs. Nesbit exulted in thrift as a necessary corrective for the nation's gluttony. "I thought smaller meals a fine idea, sending people away from the table satisfied but not stuffed," she wrote. "And I don't think we'll ever go back to those teeming dinner tables of our Mother's Day." She believed that meats should come from the cheaper cuts, while vegetables should come from cans, potatoes should be mashed, and salads should be molded from gelatin dotted with marshmallows. Some of her economical menus descended into tragicomedy. A torrent of noodles with chicken scraps, deviled meats, curried tidbits, croquettes of leftovers, carrot relish with vinegar, and a salad of pineapple slices rolled in crushed peppermint candy. The Roosevelts, she claimed, preferred simple meals, and rationing was no problem at all. In fact, FDR complained bitterly about her offerings. After one bowl of oatmeal too many, he yelled, "My God, doesn't Mrs. Nesbit know there are breakfast foods besides oatmeal? It's been served to me morning in and morning out for months and months now, and I'm sick and tired of it." Shades of George H.W. Bush complaining about broccoli. She paid no attention, declaring the president should eat plain foods plainly prepared. When FDR said he disliked broccoli, the housekeeper instructed the cooks to fix it anyhow. He should like it, she said. She believed that he and all men needed his vegetables. And when Roosevelt requested hot coffee for his guests, she served iced tea instead. It was better for them, she insisted. When he said, the vegetables are watery and I'm sick of liver and beans, those were figures of speech, Mrs. Nesbit rationalized. But the president's anguish was hardly a secret. He once wrote Eleanor, "Do you remember that about a month ago I got sick of chicken because I got it at least 6 times a week? The situation has definitely improved, but they have substituted sweetbreads. And for the past month, I've been getting sweetbreads about 6 times a week. I'm getting to the point where my stomach positively rebels, and this does not help my relations with foreign powers. I bit 2 of them yesterday." As a result, the Roosevelt's cuisine did not enjoy a very high reputation, his staff noted. Ernest Hemingway described a 1937 dinner at the White House as rainwater soup, followed by rubber squab, a nice wilted salad, and a cake some admirer had sent in. An enthusiastic but unskilled admirer. His wife, the journalist Martha Gellhorn, ate sandwiches at the airport before flying to Washington. "We thought she was crazy at the time, but said the food was always uneatable, and everybody ate before they went there to dinner," Hem wrote. "She has stayed there a lot. Me, I won't be staying there anymore." Curiously, the president seemed powerless to direct his own diet. Now, FDR was no shrinking violet when it came to Congress, industrialists, or Nazis, but he shied from confronting his own staff. Charismatic in public, Roosevelt was a loner at heart. As a single child raised by an older, distant father and an overbearing mother, he did not, quote, talk of intimate matters, Eleanor observed. Even so, everybody was against Mrs. Nesbit. Everybody except Mother, Jimmy said. Which begs the question, why was Mrs. Roosevelt so loyal? She never answered that directly. But it seems likely that Eleanor used the ham-handed housekeeper as a shield or weapon against her inconstant husband. In 1918, Eleanor discovered Franklin was carrying on an affair with Lucy Mercer, her former social secretary. It was a painful betrayal. The Roosevelts contemplated divorce, but his advisors warned it would end his political career. And when FDR raised the question with his formidable mother, Mrs. Sarah, she threatened to disinherit him. In the end, the Roosevelts stayed together for the sake of their family, politics, and money. But Jimmy recalled that from then on, the marriage became an armed truce. "I have the memory of an elephant," Eleanor wrote. "I can forgive, but I never forget." Nesbit's awful food was so dissonant with FDR's Epicurean tastes that it remains a fascination today. The historian Barbara Haber believes Eleanor backed the threadbare menus to set an example for the nation. But the biographer Blanche Wiesen-Cook wrote that Nesbit was one expression of Eleanor's passive-aggressive behavior, a tool of ER's revenge. Excuse me. In spite of this domestic turmoil, FDR remained a consummate gastro-diplomat and consistently brokered political deals while breaking bread, or even while eating hot dogs. When King George VI and his wife, Queen Elizabeth, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, embarked on a goodwill tour of Canada in 1938, Roosevelt saw an opportunity. Worried about the rise of Hitler and determined to rebuild our special relationship with Britain, he hatched a plan. The United States was still emerging from the Depression, and much of the public resented the British, who had not repaid their World War I debts. But FDR wrote the king, "I think it would be an excellent thing for Anglo-American relations if you could visit the United States. It occurs to me that you might like 3 or 4 days of very simple country life at Hyde Park. with no formal entertainments and an opportunity to get a bit of rest and relaxation. King George replied, "I can assure you that the pleasure would be greatly enhanced by the thought that it was contributing in any way to the cordiality of relations between our two countries." Thus began a risky dance. If Roosevelt's gambit backfired, the US-UK alliance would sour further, entrench American isolationists, and give Hitler a pass to invade Western Europe. But if he succeeded, he might shift the balance of geopolitical power. No reigning British monarch had ever stepped foot on US soil, and the challenge was to present the Windsors not as haughty royals who feasted on roast beef and Yorkshire pudding, but as a likable couple that everyday Americans could relate to. Roosevelt's plan called for a bit of culinary stagecraft. The king and queen arrived in Washington in June 1939 and were greeted by a large, curious crowd. The Roosevelts hosted them at a formal dinner at the White House. And after a visit to Mount Vernon and a tour of the World's Fair in New York, FDR invited them to a simple picnic at Hyde Park on June 11th. To the public's great delight, the picnic was an all-American hot dog and beer cookout. The only objector was Sarah Roosevelt, who declared that hot dogs were not suitable for the Queen. Uncharacteristically, FDR ignored his mother. As 150 guests, including earls, bishops, equerries, and ladies-in-waiting, along with the Roosevelts' friends, staff, and neighbors, made their way to Top Cottage, FDR's Fieldstone retreat, the Windsors sat on folding chairs on the porch. The hot dogs were served on silver trays, but everyone, including the Windsors, ate them from paper plates. More refined Lunchables, baked ham, roast turkey, lettuce and tomato salad, orange and lime soda, coffee and iced tea, were also provided, but only Mrs. Sarah sampled them. The king enjoyed his hot dog so much that he had a second and washed it down with a cold beer, like a regular human. The New York Times was so gobsmacked that it ran a front-page story declaring, "King tries hot dog and asks for more, and he drinks beer with them." Though FDR played the picnic down as nothing more than a weekend jaunt among friends, he and the king managed to discuss weighty matters of state in private. America was not yet at war, but Roosevelt promised to defend British convoys and sink German U-boats, and wait for the consequences. Roosevelt's hot dog summit helped shift America's resentment of Britain to a warm embrace, and just in time. 3 months later, German troops blitzkrieged Poland. The U.S. began to ship supplies to Europe in 1940, and a year later, FDR sent troops into combat. The simple lunch at Hyde Park would be hailed as the picnic that won the war. On January 20th, 1944, Franklin D. Roosevelt was inaugurated to an unprecedented fourth term. A year later, the second Big Three summit was convened in Yalta on the Black Sea. As Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin debated how to apportion post-war Germany, FDR's face was drawn and dark semicircles drooped beneath his eyes. He looked tired to the point of an inhuman loneliness. The whole world seemed to be pulling him down, Mrs. Nesbit wrote. In March, American planes bombed Tokyo and Berlin into cauldrons of flaming dust, and the end of the war was in sight. But the effort had left Roosevelt exhausted. After a weekend with Eleanor in Hyde Park, FDR departed for a vacation at his southern White House in Warm Springs, Georgia. There he soaked his polio-racked body in thermal baths, which improved his spirits and allowed him to move his right leg. But on April 12th, the president suffered a cerebral hemorrhage, and he died at age 63. As his body was carried to Washington on a funeral train, thousands of citizens paid tribute, and he was laid in state in the East Room of the White House and eventually buried at Hyde Park. On his way from Hyde Park to Warm Springs after Yalta, Roosevelt had stopped in Washington for what would be his last dinner at the White House. He ordered his lucky meal, terrapin soup. A man came in from one of the hotels and cooked it in cream and in the shell, just as he liked it, Mrs. Nesbit recalled. I was pleased that we had terrapin and that it turned out just right. Thank you. Be happy to take any questions or hear your stories. Is there a favorite story of another president? Oh, there are many. That's why I wrote a whole book about this subject. I begin the book in the introduction talking about a famous dinner that Thomas Jefferson held for James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. The two were warring over two important questions. Number one, how to repay America's Revolutionary War debts and basically construct the American financial system. And number two, where to build the federal city. And the rhetoric had gotten so heated that the further conversation in public was impossible. So Jefferson was worried that this debate was going to rip the young republic apart. Washington had only been president for a year at that point, and our democracy was really more of an idea than an actual functioning system. So Jefferson invited the two men for a secret dinner at his house here in New York City on Maiden Lane in today's Greenwich Village. And he had his slave chef, James Hemings, who had been trained in Paris at some of the finest kitchens, cook up a sumptuous meal of capon and roasted beef and served wonderful wines, had a salad. And then the pièce de résistance was a vanilla ice cream, cold vanilla ice cream served in a warm puff pastry, which was served with some very special champagne. And over the course of the dinner, he kept the conversation light and moving along. And he noticed that the men, as they ate and drank, began to soften a bit and actually began to converse as two human beings. And finally, after dinner, they got around to the horse trading of politics. And ultimately, by the end of the night, over French brandy, achieved a compromise, which became known as the dinner table bargain, in which Hamilton was allowed to impose taxes in order to repay the debts and to construct a system around that. And then in return, Madison was given what is now Washington, D.C. as a southern site for the federal capital. And that dinner has a modern resonance. We're still squabbling over taxes and the role of the federal government and other issues that are related. In fact, there's cultural relevance too. In his musical Hamilton, Lin-Manuel Miranda had a rap about this dinner, and it was called "The Room Where It Happened," and it is rapped by a jealous Aaron Burr, who was not invited to that dinner. It's all about how the sausage gets made in the back room, and that has not changed since. Has any other president weaponized food like FDR? Well, weaponized is a pretty heavy term, but I would say the presidents and first ladies who understand the value of food as a political and diplomatic tool have often succeeded better than those that don't. And a great example of that are the Kennedys. Mrs. Kennedy was a Francophile, and she intentionally built her White House entertaining on the model set by Louis XIV, the Sun King in France, who used food very intentionally to keep his friends close and his enemies closer and to broker deals. And the Kennedys did the same thing. They used it as a political and cultural tool, and it was amazingly successful. Um, Interestingly enough, the not many presidents were cooks, but I discovered that Dwight Eisenhower, who also used food in a very intentional way to build consensus and get intelligence from around the country about what was really going on and what people's concerns were. But Dwight Eisenhower was the best presidential cook in my estimation. He was raised on a farm. He was taught to hunt and fish and cook by an illiterate woodsman, and he would feed his family. Mamie didn't like to cook. He also made sure that his troops were always well fed. And it's actually one reason that he thought that D-Day went so well for the Allies, because the troops were better fed than the Germans. After the war, he became president of Columbia University here in New York, and students asked him for a recipe, thinking that maybe Mamie would give them a cake or pie recipe or something. But in fact, they got a 2-page hand-typed recipe from Ike for his mother's 2-day vegetable soup, which is a fabulous creation. I tried it when I was writing this book. You start with a big beef bone, you add vegetables, barley, and you boil it down over the course of 2 days, and the entire house becomes suffused with wonderful perfume of of vegetable soup. And then as president, Ike insisted on cooking all over the place, particularly up on the roof. He liked to grill steaks. And in the back of my book, I include 10 recipes. One of them is for Eisenhower steak, which is when you put the steak directly in the coals and cook it. And it adds a nice char on the outside and leaves the inside nice and pink. And then you just brush any dust off the top and eat it. And I highly recommend it. I'm wondering if Roosevelt's mother had lost or never had a sense of taste or smell. I can't imagine anyone not caring about food other than as fuel for the body. Well, it wasn't Eisenhower's mother so much as Eisenhower's wife, Eleanor. She, as she has said, considered food as fuel. And of course, she enjoyed eating. I think most humans do. But she was much more interested in food as an intellectual idea or as a symbol. And it really depends on how one is raised, I think. If you were raised in a milieu where you're eating fine foods and drinking fine wines and are being instructed about it, you develop a palate at an early age. And also if you travel, you get to see that. I think Eleanor's father was a drunk and a womanizer, and he died in a crash. I'm not sure what her domestic life was really like. It couldn't have been very food oriented. And so she ate food for survival. Have I ever had terrapin soup? Is it possible or legal to cook it in your own home? Well, you know what? I wanted to have terrapin soup. I also wanted to try squirrel stew and roasted possum, which were 2 other presidential dishes. William Howard Taft, our heaviest president, loved steak the most of all. He'd have it 3 times a day, but he also liked roasted possum, and people from across the country would send him possums, sometimes alive. And that is a dish that is still used in the South, but it's not very common. Squirrel stew is something that James Garfield ate, and Eisenhower also growing up. But I wasn't able to try those things, unfortunately, and I think I need to travel to do so. Did any president honor the very distinctive cuisines of the Louisiana Creoles and Cajuns? Yes, occasionally. I'm a Prud'homme. You may know of the chef Paul Prud'homme. He and I met once, and we agreed that we're probably related way back. We were all Huguenots, and after the French Revolution, the Prud'hommes were kicked out of France and went around the world. His group went down to Louisiana. My group went to Belgium, and then to China, and then to Canada, and then here. And there have been meals of Cajun and Creole cooking, but they're not a consistent thing, I'd say. One of the things in writing that one of the factors that inspired me to write this book was Julia Child, my great aunt, had gone to the White House a couple of times for state dinners and televised them. Her cameras were the first ones allowed in the White House kitchen. And she always promoted White House cooking, but she also encouraged administrations to highlight regional cuisine, such as Cajun cooking. And she actually put Emeril Lagasse on television the first time. She was the one who really got him going. She had a fine appreciation for Louisiana cooking. And she would encourage the presidents and first ladies to treat the food of the White House the way that the French do, which is to highlight the cooks and the foods, the ingredients, the techniques, and really celebrate them. Did Trump ever eat anything in the White House other than burgers? Well, steaks, lots of steaks. He liked to have his steak cooked so grilled so hard that they actually were almost incinerated, and they rocked on the plate, according to his valet. He was a real meat and potatoes president, unless he had a filet of fish sandwich. He liked Dover sole or flounder. His favorite vegetable was, the lettuce on a burger. He was a kind of a throwback in a way. Many presidents over history have loved red meat, burgers or steaks. Yet he used food in a very shrewd way politically. He in tweeting his taco bowls and Kentucky Fried Chicken, was appealing directly to his base. It turns out, and I talked to some academics for this book, it turns out that when we see somebody who wears a similar shirt to us, we think, oh, that's a nice shirt, but it doesn't really mean much. But when we see somebody eating a similar food that we like, it somehow appeals to our primitive brain. And it signals that we come from the same tribe, that we are really simpatico deep down. And so he didn't even have to say it, but the message of his famous burger banquet for the Clemson football team, which he held in the state dining room under the portrait of Abe Lincoln with, beautiful candelabras, which was fast food, burgers and fries and pizzas on silver tureens from the White House. The message was, I like fast food, you like fast food, therefore vote for me. So it was a very powerful message, and it was quite true. In your research, was the grandest of all presidential dinners? Probably possible not to. What was the grandest? Well, there were. It's hard to pinpoint one, as you might imagine, but I kind of go by century, really. You'd have to say that Thomas Jefferson was America's leading Epicurean president. He was what we now call vegetable forward. He had these wonderful gardens at Monticello, thanks to his slaves. And he ate a lot of vegetables with a little bit of protein. And he had lived in France, and he had James Hemings as this wonderfully well-trained cook, creating basically 3-star meals. U.S. Grant held the first state dinner for a foreign dignitary, for the king of the Hawaiian Islands, King Kalakaua. And that was an amazing meal with something like 32 courses made by a chef called Valentino Mela, who came from Sicily and was known as the professor because he was so meticulous in his cooking. Again, you have people like Teddy Roosevelt, who was a gourmand, meaning somebody who likes to eat a lot, and his cousin FDR, who was a gourmet, which is basically what we call a foodie now, somebody who is very interested in delicious and well-prepared foods, or the Kennedys. The Reagans, Nancy Reagan tried really hard to emulate the Kennedy style, even though she claimed that she didn't, but she was doing that, and quite successfully. She had some wonderful dinners at the White House. Um, and then of course, you have the Clintons brought a whole new kind of fresh eating um, to the White House. The Bushes were not known for their high cuisine, but they did like Tex-Mex, which is regional cooking. The Obamas were famously foodie. Michelle's garden was a great contribution to the national conversation, but also a political statement. And Barack's palate was really the most global for many years. He was born in Hawaii and raised in Indonesia. And you may recall the special TV program he did with Anthony Bourdain, where they ate bun-cha noodles in Hanoi, and that caused a sensation. And much like Trump's burgers, the images of that meal helped to define his presidency. So, going through the history, there have been some wonderful meals for the presidents. What role did local products play for FDR and family, gardening, etc.? I don't think that played a great role in terms of what they ate, but of course the victory gardens during the war were an important political tool. I include in the book some posters that come from that era where they say that food will win the war, and by getting people to grow gardens in their backyards or even on their windowsills or their roofs, they were able to save food for the American troops and the Allied effort. And it really impacted a whole generation of people, including people like Alice Waters, the famous chef at Chez Panisse in Berkeley, California, who's become a big advocate for enhancing presidential food. But she was raised with the Victory Garden at her parents' place in New Jersey. And it was something that both Eleanor and FDR could agree on, and it became a very potent propaganda tool, essentially. So, oh well. I'm very sorry I can't be there in person. It's always much more fun, but thanks for your patience with me and my coughing. Yes, well, thank you, Pam. I hope you buy several copies of the book. And by the way, I'd be happy to send signed book plates or inscribed book plates if anybody would like that. And I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. And as Julia would say, bon appetit.